this conference has meant a great deal to the Oregon community as a place where the regulated community can have really constructive, productive conversations with the regulators. And we're about to do that here. I'm very happy and pleased to be joined on my left by Anthony Barber of EPA. He is the Oregon Operations Officer and Director with Oregon EPA here in Region 10. Next to Anthony is Heather Bartlett. Heather is the Water Quality Program Manager for the the Department of Ecology in Washington. And then next to Heather is Richard Whitman, Oregon DEQ Director. So we have a brief time with you this morning before you get off to the conference. I think we're scheduled to have about 40 minutes for you. And so we're gonna just ask each other and answer questions up here, and we're gonna basically be speaking, and you can save up your energy and your pent-up enthusiasm to ask these folks questions as they disappear from the stage and meet the regulators too. So for now, thanks for your attention, and we look forward to your participation as the conference goes on. I'm gonna start with really a wide open question to ask each of you to tell me what you believe your agency's sort of most noteworthy accomplishment has been over the past year. Maybe starting with you, Anthony.
So I think of a bunch of different things. Obviously, we're involved in a lot of things across the nation. It's kind of hard to pin down one noteworthy accomplishment, but just listing a couple of different things real quick. We've done a lot of targeted investment in infrastructure, water infrastructure. We've done our efforts that we probably will get to later in this conversation on our Superfund task force and the redevelopment focus. But one of the things that I'm most proud of our agency for is helping folks recover from a lot of different natural disasters, wildfires in California, flooding in the southeast. We've had everything from typhoons in Saipan to hurricanes in the Caribbean that we've had many hundreds of thousands of man hours and effort on, that we've had tremendous positive results in helping people get back on their feet.
Thanks. We'll just go down the line.
For Washington ecology and water quality, I think our biggest accomplishments this last year, we actually have a few. The first one was we finally completed our reclaimed water rule. We've only been working at that for 10 to 12 years, so that was an incredible accomplishment to get done. We also put in a no discharge zone rule for Puget Sound to protect Puget Sound from vessel sewage. That was a huge accomplishment, another multi-year work leading up to that. And then we also completed Policy 111, which outlines how we are going to categorize waters for polluted or clean. That was a couple year process, very iterative, but it allows us to move forward with the next water quality assessment. And then the last thing that was a big accomplishment, though it's one of those things that sits behind the screen sometimes, is the lift that we had this year when our legislature finally passed a capital budget. We had 4 years really worth of projects to get under contract and the funding out. And we're still working on that now, but we had projects that were delayed from fiscal year 16 simply because our MOTCA funding, the hazardous substance tax, had a precipitous decline. So we had 2 years worth of projects that basically got put into a parking lot, along with then a series of 2 new years, fiscal year 18 and 19 project list. So, we were talking about over 300 projects and several millions of dollars that we were able to basically get under contract and out, which is incredibly important to help those communities and the recipients of all those grants and loans.
Thanks. Richard.
Thanks, Jeff. And I want to start out by thanking NEBC for again hosting this conference and the opportunity for folks in the government sector to get together with private sector and talk about a whole range of important issues. I also want to mention something. This is one opportunity for EPA and the states to talk together, but I just want to make sure people are aware we talk to each other all the time. And there's a long tradition for EPA Region 10 of sponsoring dialogue between the EPA region and the states in the Pacific Northwest, including Alaska and Idaho. And just last week, I got to spend time with Chris Laddick and my counterparts from Washington and Alaska. Idaho couldn't be on this time, but we talk in detail about some of the challenges that we're facing and share ideas. We don't always have the same perspective, but we do always talk to each other. And so just be aware that that sort of thing goes on between the state and federal government. And it goes on really regardless of changes in politics in the states or federal government. So it's something that I really appreciate EPA's leadership continuing on that. So for Oregon DEQ, this has been a great year for us. There's a lot of important stuff going on at the agency. And I have to start with talking about things going on inside the agency that aren't necessarily quite as visible to people on the outside. And that has to do with our leadership team in the agency. I've been the director at Oregon DEQ for 2 years now, and we have a very new leadership team in the agency, and that includes a new air quality administrator, Ali Mirzakhalili from the state of Delaware, where he was the air division head there for many years. And Justin Green, a new water quality administrator from the state of Florida, who was the water quality administrator there, as well as a new position in the agency, an implementation administrator who's really responsible for that connective tissue between our headquarters and our regions to make sure as we're developing policy that can be implemented, and as we're implementing, that we're doing so consistently and allocating resources in a thoughtful way. I could go on. We have a new chief information officer. We have a new communications manager, a new policy and external relations manager. So a lot of new faces at the agency, a lot of, frankly, fresh perspectives coming from different areas of government, different parts of the nation that really have energized the agency, I think, in a very significant way. As part of the work that the new leadership team is doing, we did something different with regard to our budget this time around that I don't think Oregon DEQ has done for many, many years. And that is we laid out for Oregon Governor Brown what we believe we need to implement our programs in the way that Oregonians and the business community and everybody really expects us to. And so we laid out a very ambitious agency, what's called agency request budget. Governor Brown came out with her governor's recommended budget just a couple of weeks ago, and we never expected to have everything that we asked for funded. This was intended to start a long-term conversation about Oregon's environmental programs. But we're very pleased with Governor Brown's governor's request budget. It does include some very substantial proposed investments in core programs at DEQ, and that's something I want to focus on next. Oregon DEQ has some significant challenges in terms of its core regulatory work, both in water quality permitting and to some degree in air permitting as well. And one of the things that I'm very committed to as the director and the leadership team is very committed to, and our staff are very committed to, is working through all the causes of those challenges and really getting those core programs on a footing where we're up to date, we're meeting national standards, we're providing predictability to the regulated community and businesses, and we're providing the environmental outcomes that Oregonians expect. So major elements of Governor Brown's recommended budget are investments in those parts of the agency. We're very pleased about that, and I actually would put that down as one of the accomplishments for this year. And then finally, I can't let this go without mentioning a program that I know was discussed at some length in this conference last year and that is still, I know, on people's minds, and that's our industrial air toxics program, Cleaner Air Oregon. Again, getting through the process of developing a brand spanking new industrial air toxics program that applies to both new businesses coming into the state as well as existing businesses is no small feat. We did it in basically a 2.5-year period. I'm not aware of any other program in the nation that has gone from concept to actual implementation in a 2.5-year period. We still have a ton of work to do, but we've worked through many of the difficult high-level policy issues in putting the program together, including, I'm actually very happy, including with the Oregon legislature, which represents their sort of stamp of buy-in to the program. And we're now moving into implementation phase. I do want to just stress for Cleaner Air Oregon, for most existing folks in the regulated community, there's no immediate change that is going to result from Cleaner Air Oregon. The way the program works, people go through a screening process as they are brought in, but frankly, that process of bringing people into the industrial air toxics program will happen over many years, over quite a few years. And so there's a lot of important implementation work to do, and for many businesses, you're not going to be involved in that program perhaps ever if you screen out, and then if you are brought in, it'll be a long-term process of working with the agency to reduce health risks to Oregonians. So I'm very proud of that accomplishment, very proud of the work we've done to create a new leadership team and draw a vision of what we need to run the program in Oregon. So it's been a great year.
Thanks for that. Just one piece of feedback, or maybe just for additional information about the Cleaner Air Oregon program. This conference intends to host Keith Johnson, one of the program's lead architect, working with Richard on the program over the last few years, to speak to the program and what it will mean, what implementation will look like. That's going to happen tomorrow afternoon. Pivoting a little bit from the year and its success to the coming year, in 2019, could each of you speak to your agency's regulatory priorities for 2019?
So there's a whole lot of them. Regulatory priorities. Well, one of them is clearly to stay the course with Superfund cleanup sites like Portland Harbor. So we're very dedicated to keeping on track with Portland Harbor, with several other sites across the country that are high priority, to make sure that we do whatever we can to get to the finish line. So that's a high priority. We continue both in a regulatory sense and in other ways to support our First Nations or our tribal nations in the Northwest. Some may not know that Region 10 has almost half the nation's tribes. So we have 271 tribes we work with, and there's both regulatory and capacity building work that we do with those tribes all across the Northwest. We put about $30 million into that every year just for capacity building for their environmental programs. But they have some regulatory frameworks that we work with them, including a lot of enforcement and inspection work on tribal lands. Our water programs, water quality standards work in particular in Washington and in Idaho, I'm very well aware, are a priority for us here in the Region 10. There are a lot of others. One of the key things that our administrator or regional administrator, Chris Laddick, is focused on, maybe partly because he's from Alaska, is our non-attainment area in the Fairbanks area, where they have got a lot of primarily wood smoke generated particulate matter problems. And it's just a gnarly issue to deal with. We got sub-zero temperatures a lot of the time, and the community largely depends on wood to heat their homes. And that's, it's a difficult issue to grasp or deal with. And so regulatorily, we've got to find solutions there. Those are a sampling of our regulatory priorities.
Thanks. Maybe just a follow-up question for EPA on regulatory priorities. Over the last couple of years, we've seen substantial shifts in guidance from various programs about various topics that have been in play over long periods of time. I can think certain air permitting guidance has changed in the last couple of years, and I just wonder whether it's a priority to see the guidance implemented at a regional level and then how that impacts your relationships with the state agencies, or instead whether the priorities are kind of at the macro level as you just described.
So I wouldn't pretend that I have the finger on the pulse of all those different changes.
Right.
I don't.
Right.
But I will tell you this, that we are both committed to trying to be as clear as we can with the regulated community and supporting and deferring to our states when we have an authorized or approved program that the state runs. They're in charge of it, they're running it, and so if the guidance is there that's applicable to what they're doing, then they would be the first stop in kind of answering that.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That was not on his script, so he did a very nice job. Heather, what are your priorities for 2019?
Priorities for 2019, as I talk about them now, are subject to a bit of refinement. Our governor is releasing a series of priorities and his ultimate budget by the end of this week. But certainly priorities for the agency as it relates to air quality is going to be the clean energy portfolio that he is developing and advancing. It's incredibly ambitious, but I know that we are going to be working hard to deliver. We have some new faces in our legislature, so I'm optimistic that there will be some interest in pursuing and funding the governor's requests. I think another priority is going to be continuing to make progress at Hanford, in particular to keep the Department of Energy on track for protecting the state's interest and getting to cleaning up the site. And then coming a bit, closer into the Puget Sound area, I've spent probably the last 8 or 9 months, as a participant in the governor's task force for southern resident killer whale recovery, and there are 36 recommendations that came out of that, having to do with either improving the abundance of prey, addressing vessel traffic and noise, as well as reducing and eliminating contaminants. And those recommendations are going to be reflected in some component of the governor's budget, I presume by the end of this week, and so that will definitely be a priority for water quality and really the agency, because there's a few different programs that have some level of engagement associated with either the vessel traffic, the improving prey, and then reducing contaminants. And then probably what's continuing forward from this past year is developing permits under our new really tight water quality standards for human health. Was an area that we've been working on this past year and will be something that we're continuing to work through this next year.
Thank you. Richard?
Okay, so much to talk about. I'll try to be really quick since I think I took a chunk of time on the last one, but I would have to start with climate also. I think most folks know that the Oregon legislature is going to take, a serious crack at some form of cap and invest in this legislative session, and details on that should be rolling out here in the near future. The thing I would point out with regard to climate is there are so many aspects of reducing greenhouse gas emissions that we need to be working on in order to succeed in this effort. And Cap and Invest is extremely important, is a cornerstone program, but other programs, frankly, are going to be extremely important as well. And I'll just mention a couple that Oregon DEQ is already tasked with responsibility for implementing. One of those is the Clean Fuels Program, the Low Carbon Fuels Program, which is really the main short-term tool we have for reducing transportation greenhouse gas emissions, perhaps the most difficult piece of the carbon puzzle. But also another program that I think is emerging is extremely important in this effort as well, and that's what we call our materials management program, which is a program really aimed at reducing consumption of particular materials and really brings a whole set of new potential tools to reducing carbon emissions and other environmental impacts from how we consume things. So I think you're going to hear more about that in this conference in the next couple of days, but it's a program to keep an eye on at Oregon DEQ. Other things that are important, Portland Harbor. So continuing implementation work between Oregon DEQ, which is the entity responsible for the upland portion of Portland Harbor, and EPA, which is responsible for the in-water work, making sure that we are moving forward with a record of decision and moving forward with remedial design at particular areas within the harbor is a key priority for us in this coming year. Two other things to mention. DEQ, one of the things that the legislature and the governor are investing in at the agency is a completely new environmental data management system, or we call it EDMS. And we just let the contract, are just about to sign the contract for that system, and we'll be starting the process of working with the vendor to bring that system in place, which will be over actually several years. And so you're going to start to see a lot of changes, not just in the IT side, but also the business process side of how we do our work. So that's a major focus. And then finally, I'll just mention we have a couple of what I would call mega projects that are taking some attention as well. One of those is the proposed Jordan Cove LNG pipeline and terminal in southern Oregon and on our coast. And then we also have something that's really new for Oregon, which is a proposed gold mine in eastern Oregon. And it's the first large-scale gold mine that we've permitted in the state that's just starting to go into the permitting process now. So there are more, but some very large projects moving forward.
Thanks for those answers to reflect both the agency's successes and then priorities looking forward. Maybe pivoting backward, covering the flank a bit. What do you see as your greatest challenges? Starting with you, Anthony.
So Jeff, as an attorney, this is not meant to offend anyone with a law degree or profession here in the audience, but probably one of our biggest challenges is defensive litigation. We often see defensive litigation as helpful, but at least as often we see it as an impediment to good environmental outcomes. And so that's one of the biggest challenges we have. One as well, I'll just do another pivot toward an internally focused item, and that is with a changing demographic, maybe a generational effect or other things, we have a wave of retirements and a pattern of behavior with environmental professionals, many of which are in the audience here, who are younger folks like to stay to 3 to 5 years and then move on to something else. So that's a challenge too.
Thank you. Heather?
So I would echo, litigation is a constant challenge. It just seems like it's a little bit more present right now. It's heavily influencing our work, or we're spending time addressing litigation rather than doing some of the work that people were initially hired to do. The other challenge, I would say, is that we are the smallest western state with the largest population base, yet we are incredibly progressive and environmentally protective as a general rule. So it's finding that space between environmental protection that the residents want and often strive for, yet making room for a population that just continues to grow, particularly in the Puget Sound region. How do we find that place that we're protecting our water and our critters and creatures, having clean air that we all want, and have the mountains and nearby, so that we can recreate and enjoy the outdoors and trust that the environment that we're living in is healthy for us as well. That's a challenge. And I would say the third thing, I thankfully was maybe on the early wave of retirement and would like to say that we looked inside the program for water quality anyway, looked inside the program, and we changed some of the ways that we were hiring. We made ourselves more nimble. We put in some structures and systems that have to be fully proof tested, but are helping us not lose ground in the work as we have people retiring or moving into new positions and opportunities. But the other thing that we're beginning to experience is our federal funding. 20% of the agency is pretty much supported by federal funding, and that's not increased. It's been flat. The work remains, and the cost of the people have gone up. So finding ways of getting the work done that's expected with less revenue to cover the increased cost is a challenge that we're, I think, beginning to certainly experience.
Richard, challenges, setbacks?
Sure. So similar to what Heather said, the challenge of working in a state that has very diverse regions and very diverse economies, very diverse, frankly, expectations from the public in terms of the role of an environmental agency is challenging. For Oregon DEQ, I think we have a renewed emphasis across the agency focused on protecting public health, not just the environment. So that's particularly important in our air programs and some of our hazardous waste programs, cleanup. Emergency response is a big challenge for us. Thank you, Washington, for helping us some on that. Finding that right balance between really strengthening public trust in a government agency that is charged with protecting public health and the environment, at the same time reassuring the regulated community that we're in this for the long term. We need to work with you. We need your help many times in figuring out ways to get to outcomes that can work for both of us. So that's a constant challenge, and both communicating that and actually carrying that out. And that was at the top of my list. And then I have to say the stream of change, I'm being very neutral here, in terms of policy from the federal government is a challenge right now. We have our hands full just focusing on Oregon issues, but at the same time, we are being affected by proposed changes at the federal level, and figuring out how to play constructively in that dialogue, responsibly in that national dialogue, while also thinking long-term about protecting Oregon's interest in terms of the environment and our business community is a challenge right now. You know, the EPA is announcing today its proposal on waters of the U.S. That is just another example of a pretty significant proposed change in federal policy that states are everybody's gonna be looking to the states to see how they react to that change. And you know, we already have our hands full, so having to take on things like that is just, it's a challenge right now.
Thank you. One challenge that I hear in working with the regulated community involves something that I think Heather pointed out, which is that as the federal budget for state environmental agencies, and your two agencies in particular, remains constant, as state legislative support waxes and in some cases wanes, the regulated community worries that the balance will be made up through fees. Can you just speak to the agency's approach to fee-based programs and to say something to the concern that the regulatory community has, especially the stationary source regulatory community? The stationary sources within the states that worry that more and more of the agency's budgets will come off of their facilities.
You want me to take that one first?
Sure.
So it's only fair. I've been going last this whole time so far, so thank you. So I want to divide this perhaps into talking about each of the main three program areas in the agency, because they're somewhat different. First of all, with regard to federal funding, Oregon is at the low end of the spectrum nationally for resources that we receive from the federal government. We're actually just over 10% of our budget comes from the federal government. That's a good news, or a bad news, good news thing, I guess I would say. It's not increasing, and it's not, at least in any near term, going to be any part of how we fund this work long term. So in the air arena with a new industrial air toxics program, with a desire to work on not just industrial sources, but also on mobile sources. We've got some conversations that need to happen about how to fund some of that work that need to occur. We're very aware that with both the focus on our core air permitting work and the focus on industrial air toxics, we've got some big asks that we're making of the regulated community in terms of fees. I do not expect we're going to resolve that in 1-2 year bite. That's going to need to be a conversation about a number of years, a number of legislative sessions, a number of biennia in terms of what happens with fees. And so I think headed into this session, we are very eager to engage with the regulated community to talk about not just what does the next 2 years look like, but really what does the next 10 years look like in terms of fees and in terms of other support for the program. So in water, the situation is similar, but perhaps even more dynamic. There's historically been more general fund support for DEQ's water quality program. But again, we're looking at working on that backlog, working on that core work. We're looking at some potentially significant fee increases for the regulated community. At the same time, Governor Brown is working with a number of state agencies, including Oregon DEQ, but also our Water Resources Department, about a very long-term vision for water, including water quality and quantity in Oregon, and how we fund that work, both the governance regulation side, but also the investment infrastructure side. Washington, I know, has been going through similar work. Part of that conversation is what's the funding source for that work, including the water quality work long term. That is not going to be, we're starting to set the stage for that conversation, but it will be 2 to 4 years of work to really carry that out. And we expect to do that in a fully collaborative way with the regulated community, with local government, as well as other partners. And then finally, in the area of emergency response, which I have to touch on briefly, and hazardous waste. So we had some big ask in our agency request budget on emergency response, and Governor Brown has proposed funding those. So we're very pleased with that. That has been it's one of the things that wakes me up at night, is just how thin Oregon is staffed on emergency response. So I'm very hopeful that that will get some solid primarily general fund support in this legislative session. And then finally in cleanup, I have heard concerns in the property owner community about the availability of DEQ staff to provide timely oversight of projects. And that's a conversation I want to continue to hear more about. There's no connection directly between the funding for that work and the funding for DEQ's other programs. So we need to look at how we're staffing, how we're funding that work. There should be a way of fixing that problem. And so I'm very interested in talking about that further. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Richard. Heather?
So I can speak to the water quality because that's the one I know the best. Our permit fees are actually captured in statute. The permit fee program implementing the MPDS program within the state of Washington is supposed to recover its costs, essentially. And then we affect that through rules, specific rules that we update every 2 years as it relates to what the specific fee is going to be. But we have a number of fee categories. It's very diverse, and it reflects the different permit fee payers that we have. And for the last 3 biennia, we have worked extremely hard to keep that. We have 2 categories as we look at them: overpayers and underpayers. And though we are to recover our operate our permit fee program, our MPDS program, at recovered costs through the permit fee payers, we have a category that is an overpayer, and several categories that are underpayers. And so we worked hard the last 3 biennia to bring the underpayers up. They are taking the fiscal growth factor, we are adding it into their permit fee and keeping the overpayers, which tends to be our industrial dischargers, at where they have been, either status quo, or they will have a much smaller increase just to keep it balanced, or try to bring more balance back into it. Some of our permit fee categories are specifically capped in statute, which presents some challenges in and of itself, because if you've got 6,000 permittees like we do, and some subset has theirs capped in statute, it places the burden when we do rule changes on those that are the ones that we can adjust. So all that is to say, when we go through our rule process every 2 years, we work very hard to keep the changes right around the fiscal growth factor, and for those that have been the overpayers, we work hard to keep them maybe where they actually have been, and put the responsibility for the increasing costs and recovering those costs on the underpayer category, which can be the number of permittees in that category is large.
On behalf at some level of the regulated community, we just sort of thank you for your sensitivity, both agencies, to the fee issue. It is, and we realize it continues to be dynamic and an important discussion, but it is a very significant concern, and we appreciate your sensitivity to it. Pivoting there, maybe to get Anthony back on the hot seat, in the era of change at the federal level, what places do you believe that you have the most in common with DEQ and ecology in working together, at least in the next 2 years?
Well, one of the things that we have, a tool in our toolbox that we use with both states and many other states across the country, and even some tribes, is our performance partnership agreements we have with them, which are coupled with grants that are some of the pass-through money that the states really depend upon. So those performance partnership agreements are biennial in most cases, and really catalog our common ground. And a lot of that common ground is on how we do enforcement, how we do our approaches to air quality and so forth. And we with the next 2 years, the next 5, 10 years, I anticipate that the good clean water, good clean air, reliable, predictable regulatory processes are of mutual interest to all of us, both Oregon, Washington, and the other states, and everybody here. So I don't think that there's a sort of the hint. The next few years is an administration related. And I just want to be very forthright that, we don't have a difference under the Trump administration or any other administration with that regard. We're staying the course with environmental laws that we are charged to implement, and those include those facets. A sort of emphasis on climate adaptation as opposed to climate mitigation is a common area that we have still with our states. And I think there's been a shift in some of the language under the Trump administration as far as sustainability versus resilience, essentially meaning the same thing, but as each administration comes in, and this is my 6th, language changes, but oftentimes the meanings of those words don't. And so if we talk about disaster resilience, or if we talk about environmental sustainability, we may be defining those in the exact same way, but using different terms. So if we recognize those differences in language and continue to do the work together, I think we'll be successful.
Thanks. That's a positive message for us all. The number of minutes that we have to present to you here are dwindling. We have topics ranging from the Portland Harbor to upland source control to water quality standards and many, many more that I had planned to talk about. But given our state, what would you like to say in closing, especially focused on perhaps what the regulated community what you would like them to know about the agency, your work that you're doing. Leave it to you to provide a closing remark. Anthony, we'll start with you.
So I think you said, what would I like them to know about the
Yeah.
work that we're doing?
Yeah.
I almost want to shift that to what would I like them to know about the people that are doing that work. Some of our people have come from the ranks of private companies, environmental professionals, and attorneys, like the folks here. And all of them, I think, get up every morning with the idea that they're going to come to work. I'd like to think every morning. Maybe some days they have a bad day, but they come to work with the idea that we're there not just to protect human health, to protect the environment, but to do it in ways that are sensible and cooperative and with the economic cost and benefit in mind. And so I think that knowing that about our folks, knowing that by and large, we want to be accessible. Please don't hesitate to call us. Please, let's have an open and frequent conversation. I think that to me is something that really we don't want the curtain between our regulatory agency and the regulated community to be opaque. We want it to be as transparent as possible, or even not there. And so that's, I guess, what I would say.
Thank you.
I would say what I would want the regulated community to think about within ecology is how important we see the partnership being with the regulated community. We see our success moving forward, protecting the environment, whether it's air, water, or land, needing to be done in partnership with the regulated community, because part of what makes Washington so great is, in fact, the very things that I described are challenges, that we have a great economy, we have opportunity for more people moving in, and we have people who love the state and the greenness and the environment around it. So the partnership that we have with the regulated community is integral to our success in protecting the state's interest and ensuring that it has, continues to have the economic engine that it does.
Thanks, Heather. Richard?
Two quick things. One, on Portland Harbor, again, very much appreciate the strong partnership between Oregon DEQ and EPA. Governor Brown several times has publicly stated this is kind of her example of great partnership between the state of Oregon and the federal administration. We had leaders from EPA out here recently to meet with folks in the regulated community and also with Oregon DEQ, and we're very pleased by the messages that they were delivering in terms of staying the course on Portland Harbor. An important part of that is folks who have already stepped up to the plate to start doing work in the harbor on remedial design and moving that effort forward. So we're looking for more partners to do that. We're looking to help people do that over the next year or two. And that's a really critical centerpiece for this metro region in terms of long-term returning the harbor to both its historic use and also to new uses and the opportunities that presents. I think it's very exciting. And then finally, I also want to mention one other major policy thing that we're involved in right now, which is around mercury in the Willamette Basin. And it has a lot of different angles, including a new clean water plan, total maximum daily load, but also including variances for particular parties and a first for Oregon, a multi-discharger variance that's proposed. And dealing with a pollutant where much of the loading is not within anybody's control, or immediate control at any rate. So working through all the policy pieces, I think there are market opportunities associated with that for folks in the business community and in local government. And I think it's time to get creative. We want to find a path, and we're going to need help from the regulated community to figure out exactly what that looks like.
Thank you for today. And now looking to all of you, this is your first official chance to participate in the conference. Can you please thank the panel and wish them a warm holiday season?